Welcome to today's FO discussion. I'm Peter Isaacson, the Chief Strategy Officer of Fair Observer. Today's theme, which we'll be doing with two other guests, is I call it trying to make some kind of sense of the European parliamentary elections, which took place last week. Today, I'm joined by two friends of the journal, Alex Gloy, who bears the title Editor-at-Large at Fair Observer. He's also our expert in international finance and anything related to money matters. My other guest is Sebastian Schaefer, director of the Institute of the Danube Region and Central Europe, IDM. Both of my guests are German, though Sebastian is based in Vienna, not in Germany, Vienna, Austria, and Alex in New York. So we cover some distant geographical ground. First of all, I want to thank both of you for accepting the invitation and accepting especially to participate in what I want to be a freewheeling discussion between the three of us, looking at the various things that have emerged in the last week, but which are part of a much larger context. Just a few words about myself. I grew up in the US during the Cold War, but I've been based for most of the past 50 years in France. I possess dual nationality, at least for a while. Since the National Rally, I learned this morning, Marine Le Pen's party proposes to force all French citizens, all French dual nationals like myself, to choose one of our nationalities. Now, I plan this as a freewheeling discussion, as I mentioned, and I'd like to add another motto to it, because at Fair Observer, we have the motto, make sense of the world, which is a great ambition that we always have. But in reality, the best we can ever do is to try to make sense of the world. And in this case, try to make sense of Europe. Anything we say today could very well be contradicted, or we'll have to modify tomorrow. So we're not a group of Nostradamuses trying to tell all our wonderful audience about what the future is going to look like. We don't know. I hope you guys will agree, because I certainly don't know. So there's several things that have emerged, which I think people agree about. But I think the biggest thing that people have in mind today when looking at the results of this election, but also the context in which the election took place, is that Europe is in crisis. And maybe you could say it's multiple crises going on at the same time. And we have little sense of how any of these crises are going to wind down or play out. So I'm here in France, where, as I mentioned, things are coming to a boil very quickly with an election that in many ways symbolizes the lessons people have drawn from this election, which is that there's a stronger influence of the extreme right. Now, this has particular meaning in Germany. It has particular meaning in France because we have this election. So these are things we'll be talking about. I just wanted to suggest that we have the other motto or subtitle I wanted to throw in is, we are in the unknown, but not in the unobserved. So our job and your job, anyone out there, is to keep observing this world and help us to understand it. So to kick things off, Sebastian, could you give us some insight into, because I want to focus on France to start with, but can you give us some insight into how you and people in the German-speaking world and in Austria and Germany think about the French election, first of all? What kind of impression is coming out?
Thank you, Peter, and thank you for inviting me to this discussion. I'm very much looking forward to actually learn also something from this, because I mean, your question is very relevant. However, we are, of course, only observing from Central Europe what is happening in France, as we are not very much specialized in this country. In any case, one thing that I can tell you with being based in Austria, as you mentioned, Austria is the second country in these European elections that have voted a far-right party as the first party in this election next to France. It's a very interesting development, also from a point of a German citizen, in a sense that these two far-right parties are still in one political grouping in the European Parliament, but consider then the German far-right party too extreme to be part of their political group. And if we look at the election results for the AfD, the Alternative for Germany, there's of course also the appalling situation that on the one hand side, they have been the strongest party in East Germany, and they have been amongst the most popular parties with the new voters, which for the first time in this election, Germans under the age of 18, starting from 16, were allowed to vote. And from this conglomerate, looking at now these announced snap elections from Macron, seems to be very worrisome and counterintuitive in a sense that why would you at this moment where there is apparently a momentum for Marine Le Pen start snap elections? On the other hand, of course, there is some sort of hope that the next election will be different. And here's another parallel to what is happening in Austria, because there will be regular parliamentary elections held in September. And here again, now also the sense is that this election will be different and that the far-right Freedom Party will not become first in those elections. I'm very skeptical in all these directions. And on top of this, we also have elections in the East German Länder, where we also would probably observe that the AfD might become the strongest party there. So the next couple of months are going to be very interesting in the sense of how this far right can further surge or consolidate their election results. And I have been in various formats this week looking back at these elections, and I have stressed very much all the time that this phrase, the center holds, is very dangerous because in theory, yes, but in practice, we will have to see there's still movement when it comes to the political groupings, and there is still a possibility that there will be a far-right Eurosceptic party, the third biggest political grouping in the European Parliament, and we cannot lean back and say, well, the center held, yeah, maybe this time, but what about next time? And next time might come sooner than we expect.
This raises everything you say is a great interest. It raises two questions in my mind, because you talk about the center and you talk about the extreme right. One of the things that's appeared in France, because we've been, let's say the media have been obsessed, or anyway, they've had a permanent curiosity about our interest in how the far right was progressively challenging what you call the center. I'm not even sure what the center is in France, and I'd like to know what it is, how it's perceived to be in the rest of Europe. But I also don't know what the far right is anymore. And this is something that's coming out in France, which, and it certainly comes out in my conversation with American friends, when they say, oh, what about Marine Le Pen? Is she, how far right is she? And I have to say that if her party was proposing the kinds of ideas and programs that they talk about, apart from denying dual nationality, which I mentioned earlier. If they were doing that in the US, I maintain that apart from the xenophobic side of it, they would be to the left of the Democratic Party in American terms. Why? Because they're all for social programs and supporting the working class and all that kind of thing, which no party in the US is no official accepted party in the US is willing to do. So I have extreme doubts now about what it means to say center and right and left altogether. Do you or Alex have any ideas of that? Alex, you're in the midst of the American situation, the US situation. You've got an election coming up, which the whole world's attention is focused on. How do you see that?
Yeah, so I grew up in Germany, of course, with the Social Democrats and the CDU, the Christian center-right party, both being the behemoths, both around 40-45%, and the liberals being the kingmaker. And I mean, they inserted some sort of instability, but generally you knew that would be one of the two big parties and a coalition partner, maybe with the help of the Green Party that emerged when I was in high school. And that center has been completely hollowed out. Voters have moved to both extremes, the left and the right. And it's interesting that the left basically has kind of imploded with most famous politician Sarah Wagenknecht founding her own party and coming right out of the starting blocks with 6% or so of the vote. That is so the voter base has become extremely mobile, if you want to say, and nothing is set in stone anymore. And it's probably testament to dissatisfaction or disillusionment of the voter base with the established parties in the center, and being very susceptible to certain dog whistles, be it fear of over immigration or rent increases or job losses. And that is completely different, a completely different political landscape from the time when I grew up and how I know it.
So that's very pertinent, everything you say there. And it comes back to the question I was asking about the perception of what the different parties are. Sebastian, you were saying that traditionally the center includes the center right and the center left, right? So we think of that as just what the ruling bloc. Now, this was the case in France, of course, for all the time ever since the end of the Second World War. We've had a pretty solid right-wing base which consolidated around de Gaulle, obviously, at one point, but then it stretched outside of the purely Gaullist tradition, but it remained pretty much the governing right for quite a long time. And then Mitterrand arrived. So we had a left wing, which tried to do some radical things socially. He nationalized all the banks. He nationalized all the big industry. It looked as if he was turning France into the Soviet Union. Although he wasn't a communist, he was very worried about his communist partners. But it turned out that all of these reforms that looked to be radical were part of a different centrist agenda. So in France, up until 2017, we assumed that we were going to be ruled by the socialists, or whatever name the principal right-wing party had taken, a centrist party, sorry. No, well, this is the whole confusion about all these labels. And I think this is a major cultural factor, that we're starting to lose a sense of what any of the labels we use in politics are. And this is true in Europe, it's true in the US, it's maybe even true in India, as we're seeing. So this idea of the center being one of the establishment parties that guaranteed a continuity, even when they did radical things like Mitterrand, they guaranteed a continuity of the institutions. Even if you change the ownership of who was running these big institutions, such as corporations or banks, the practices remained under control by a group of people who seemed to know what they were doing. And we had to trust them to continue doing it and making things work as smoothly as possible so that we could live our lives. In France, all this changed to some extent in 2017, when some odd factors really made it possible for Macron, a non-party centrist, that he didn't have a party, he was just Macron. So he had to invent a party to take power. But because of the system in France, which starts with a presidential election and not with a parliamentary election, it's the man who determines which party, or man or woman, and because the next one may be a woman, they're the ones who determine what I would call the center is going to be after that. And there are a lot of people saying now about the French elections, if Le Pen wins, if the RN, the Rassemblement National, the National Rally, if they win this election, and I don't think they will, I don't think the French will allow them to win. That's my personal take. It has always been that way. I've debated people for 10 years who say, oh, Marine Le Pen, she's going to take over. But even if she did, I think, given the way things work, the way we've seen things work, even in cases like Mitterrand changing the whole system, or at least superficially, it tends to, or Meloni in Italy. So she was supposed to be the new Mussolini. And part of her thing was that she was going to challenge Europe, or challenge Italy's adherence to Europe. She didn't, and she's become a very good European. She appears to be supporting Ursula von der Leyen, so is there a center that will always be there, even if someone on the extreme right or extreme left takes over? That's the question. Sebastian, maybe, yeah.
I mean, we were talking about now a lot about France. You were, in that sense, the phrase that worries me is with regards to the European parliamentary elections. And we have, of course, a center there, in the sense that there are parties that have different political views on a maybe more conservative, on a more social democratic, on a more liberal, on a more green, on a more left wing idea of what the European Union should look like. But there's a general consensus that we accept institutions that we adhere to democratic principles, and that we are united in diversity and accept this diversity. And I think this is what would be a center. Now again, I'm not an expert in French politics, and I've read that yes, maybe if Macron is the center and the left and the right are at the moment dissolving, and this is strengthening the extreme left and the extreme right, where I would say it's certainly not the case that we have seen a surge in left-wing extremism in Europe.
No.
Not in this election, and also not in the past decade. We've seen a surge in right-wing extremism. And the very challenge that I see, and also when you mention Meloni, which at the moment appears to have different standpoints in certain areas with regards to not as much challenging the EU institution as the Lega has done it, not cutting off support for Ukraine, but ultimately what she's achieving, trying to achieve with that is, of course, a sort of acceptance and normalization of certain positions. And this is the danger that I see when we see the center held. If we continue like this, then next election, maybe it's not 80% anymore, it's only 60%. And then the next election after that is less than 50%, because we are sort of normalizing in this discussion something that becomes acceptable and moves into the center. And here also the definition of left and right, of course, is on the one hand side, something that you can do from a political science perspective, and then it is very clear. It has very clear categories in what would be considered left-wing politics and what would be considered conservative right-wing politics. But if you have your nowadays, I have the feeling you have there's a personal standpoint and a personal adjustment of a coordination system, which means that if you consider, of course, if you are positioning yourself from your personal views, I'm not saying you, Peter, but you as a person, that a lot of things become very left-wing. I don't see, for instance, the center in Germany being hollowed out. I see a very clear shift in what is certainly suddenly accepted in politics. Because I also remember situations where certain phrases were issued by certain politicians, and that was the end of their career. And this is just now, today is just another Tuesday in the German Bundestag. And this is the challenge that I see, and this is the danger that comes when we say, well, the center held, and maybe it's not so bad after all. Yeah,
Alex, did you want to say something there?
Yeah, absolutely agree. The kind of normalization that it's okay to support a right-wing party, given the history of the country, that is surprising. But
this surprises people outside of people outside of Germany.
Yes, but yeah. I mean, I look at a lot of things, of course, from financial markets. And if I look at my screen here, I see the German 10-year government bond yield at 2.36 today, which is down 0.11, and the French at 3.17, which is unchanged. So the difference between those two, which was half a percentage point a week ago, and about 0.7 yesterday, is quickly approaching a full percentage point, which is almost reminiscent of the last big euro crisis. So this has me very worried. And So
So what does that mean in terms of the relationship between Germany and France?
yeah, so Germany was always of course, part of the hard currency bloc, and the French franc suffered a couple of devaluations while the Euro project was in its infancy and then later in the preparatory stages, and each devaluation was humiliating for the French government. And but the Germans had something in exchange to give up. There was the Deutschmark, so that France could be was motivated to run a tighter fiscal policy than they would have otherwise. But what can Germany offer today? I mean, of course, there's the main bargaining chip is that nobody wants the euro to fall apart, but there are still imbalances. And if you look at the target 2 balances and the European Central Bank system of payments, Germany is basically sponsoring the whole thing with 1.2 trillion euros, and the Mediterranean countries still have trade deficits intra euro area, and so I mean, the European project is a bit stuck right now, and it would make absolute sense to do away with national government bonds. In my opinion, the European Central Bank should just, or some entity, maybe similar to the bailout vehicles that were set up during the Euro crisis, should just buy up all the individual government bonds and issue bonds by a supranational entity. Then we wouldn't have this problem of spread widening anymore.
So what's preventing that? Why wouldn't that solution?
The German Constitutional Court has, of course, ruled that there's a maximum that the ECB can buy of other countries' government bonds, and I think we are already at the limit. So there's no more wiggle room left. And the German voter would, of course, hate for the government to be seen as bailing out fiscally less responsible countries at their expense. So so it would have to be done kind of behind their back, which will, of course, be met with a lot of political resistance. But yeah, otherwise we will always be can be held hostage by the markets. That sudden spread widening will then have domino effects. Suddenly people then look a little bit closer at debt to GDP ratios and Italy, and is this sustainable? And before you know it, you have again a financial crisis on hand with you saw bank stocks suffering this week quite substantially, because they, of course, hold some of these government bonds. And that's the last thing that Europe needs right now, is a banking crisis.
Yeah. So is this also an indication of a more general identity crisis of Europe? Because what you're talking about is one of the possible solutions. And I think there's another side of this, is the thing that Macron particularly has been insisting on and then playing with in various ways, and that is the military unification of Europe. Those are the two missing. I was going to ask Sebastian earlier about whether it actually matters what happens in the European Parliament, because first of all, it doesn't even have the power of a national parliament. It has a power of veto. It doesn't have the power to initiate legislation. And is it just a club for talking about public issues? And is that an indication of a general weakness in the whole system, which everyone accepts, because we know that Europe is not the United States of Europe. It's whatever it is. It has to be decentralized and remain decentralized at the same time as being one big unit. Isn't there a big element of identity crisis in that? And isn't that reflected in the voting as well? Sebastian, would you like to?
Well, first, you're right with the lack of the right of initiative, and I've argued for granting it to the Parliament in my policy advice for probably already a decade again as well. But it's not as powerless as it might seem through this, because of course everything, with very few exceptions, that is decided on an EU level is co-decided with the European Parliament. And the days of where it was only a possibility to sort of have also a debate but not a decision power are long over. What is true, though, is that we have a second chamber that is participating in this legislative process, and this is the Council of the European Union.
Yeah.
And here we have the ministers from the member states. And here, of course, there is a very high national component to it that is also reflected in the European parliamentary election, because it's not one election, it's 27 national parallel elections. And you can see that, of course, not only in the situation that we have now, the negotiations for around 100 seats that are non-aligned yet, because either they have been voluntarily gotten out of a political grouping, or have been kicked out of a political grouping, or have been newly elected to the European Parliament because the party wasn't there before, or they didn't make it in the last election, which is, with a membership of 720 currently, quite a substantial number of MEPs that do not have a political grouping yet.
Wow.
Saying that we don't see transnational lists, unfortunately, we don't see a transnational program, and there's even, of course, differences between a French conservative party, a German conservative party, and a, let's say, Romanian conservative party. And this is what it also makes, of course, the whole thing in the decision-making process a bit complicated. So,
do you think there's a perception of something that can be called European politics? Because this is a question I would ask about the elections themselves. When people vote, are they voting with the idea of Europe in mind, or of their nation? And if they're not voting with an idea of Europe's future and their place in it and the impact of whatever they think, or the people that represent them think, on their common future, can it lead to rational decision making that has a meaning at the same time for the European institutions, but for the European people as well?
I think it's very challenging that there is not a European discussion in these elections. We could see that in Austria very much. I also voted in Austria. As a EU citizen, you can choose if you vote in your country of birth or in the country you are currently residing. I opted for Austria already 5 years ago, and then it stays like this. And I was therefore following, of course, the debate here, especially. And we had not a content debate, where we had a personality debate to a certain extent, and then, of course, a clear point from the Freedom Party, the far-right extremist party, that simply said, we want to stop the European Union. And everything else has not been discussed. And I observed that in very many countries, that there is not a election about what the party would want for Europe. The Conservative Party in Austria, for instance, had on their electoral billboards, Europe, but better. But I, until now, have not really understood what would make it better from their perspective. The Social Democrats said neutrality, which is something that is very important for the Austrians.
Yes.
But what does that mean on a European level? So
that hasn't
you see,
been
there's
with
not much content. And if you look at electoral outcomes and also the motives behind why people voted for the parties, you rarely find content, with a few exceptions. The Green Party, for instance, is voted for climate issues, but that's kind of their unique selling point. Whereas other parties are voted for, I have always voted for that party, or I vote for the Spitzenkandidat, or the lead candidate. I vote for to stop this and that, but not for something that is content. And this is what makes it challenging on a European level. If we don't have a content debate, but a personal debate or a national party debate, it will not become European, because 60 kilometers from here in Bratislava, nobody cares about the Social Democratic Party in Austria. They are concerned with their own parties and the challenges that they are putting on the debate agenda.
Yeah, so that kind of symbolizes or sums up this tension between that I call an identity problem. When will Europeans decide they're Europeans rather than whatever local identity? And do they have a local identity? Because that's the other problem with the right wing, the far right in Europe, is that they appear to be insisting on the idea that there is something that can be identified or considered to be the basis of their national identity or their regional identity. And that's not very clear at all, because we don't know what kind of historical roots they're referring to. And then it gets very confused when you start looking at the kinds of issues that well, actually, to simplify it all, in most cases, the focus is on immigration, not on who we are, but who we aren't, and the people who aren't like us. So if there aren't people who aren't like us, then we may end up knowing who we are. And this is a basic existential problem within European culture today, in my opinion, which leads to another question. When I say a question, I'm trying to understand these things. If you look at the way the right wing, the extreme right, has had an impact on elections, therefore having increasingly more success, which we're all worried about. If you look at what their concerns are, because we were trying to look at the issues they might be interested in, but we know the interests. It's easier to find the ones they're not interested in, such as immigration. We're not interested in having foreigners, but we're also not interested, and this is certainly clear in France, in having technocrats running our country. And it's a rather widespread feeling that Europe is the European Union is a technocracy. Then we have, in France, that becomes more complicated, because Macron is seen as someone who's not fundamentally political. He's a technocrat. He comes from the banking industry. He hired McKinsey to do the audits. which really shocked a lot of French people, that you would go to an American company like McKinsey to try to sort out what France needs or how it's doing its business. So there's this rejection of technocracy. And the far right, Marine Le Pen's party, has been really good at developing that. So in a certain sense, I would be willing to say today that a lot of the vote for Le Pen is not a vote for the values she represents or the ideas or ideologies. It's a vote for someone who's protesting against technocracy. And then there's another dimension, and here I'll be a little more impertinent, and that is the perception that Europe doesn't have a backbone and that it's subservient to the US. And the Ukraine war is the biggest example of that. That's a sentiment that the media will not allow to be expressed, even though it's very real. But it does have an impact on elections, and the impact, unfortunately, is to direct attention towards the extreme right, which has traditionally been against other kinds of involvements outside of the country itself. Just as in the US, the big debate is about interventionism or isolationism. How do you feel about those issues and the impact that they have and where they might lead in terms of the way Europe is evolving today?
I mean, my grandfather was still shooting at French people in Second World War, and the European Union was born out of the idea that countries who trade with each other don't go to war with each other. And at the beginning was the Community for Coal and Steel. The French had the coal and the Germans needed it to make the steel. And so also the fathers of the euro, like Jacques Delors and Helmut Kohl, they acted, of course, still under the impression of the horrors of Second World War. And I'm afraid these horrors are fading from memory. So the younger generations don't share the same feelings that the European project must move forward. And I mean, we had Schengen, before you had to stop at every border in Europe. Now you can just drive through. It's wonderful. Or you went on vacation, you came back with a bag of coins that you didn't know what to do with, shillings and French francs and the lira, and you had to always calculate in your head how much that ice cream was now in thousands of lira, and that's all gone. That's wonderful, but people today take it for granted, and what is missing is a vision for the next step. And I'm also afraid the European project has a little bit been stopped in its tracks, of course, by the Brexit. I mean, before that, we were 511 million people. And if you go to Washington and you speak for 511 million people, that has a certain weight in negotiations. And now there is a bit of lack of vision. And for another vision, if you're in a weak position as a politician, you're not in a it would be grandstanding to table bold ideas, and because nobody will follow and you will just be attacked. So the European idea is in a little bit of a difficult situation right now, and the strengthening of the far right, of course, doesn't help. So I think what is needed is to give again a vision for where people can get excited for, and that optimism can be instilled back into individuals, while also reminding them where we come from less than 100 years ago.
If I may add a little bit to that, because of course what has been said is largely true, but it's a very Western European experience, because there are still countries within the European Union that don't experience that they do not have to calculate in their head what the ice cream costs, that still have to stop at borders. And there are countries outside of the European Union that, of course, also have the same experience as the ones that I mentioned. But additionally to that, experience a war since years, or have experienced a bloody war of succession of the former Yugoslav countries in not so long ago as it has been the case that you've mentioned for Germany and France. So in that sense, I don't think, and you know, I mean, it's always a cheap joke, but it has a grain of truth to it. The former German Chancellor Helmut Schmidt always said, "If you have visions, you should see a doctor." I think we don't need a vision. We need to be brave, and this is what you mentioned with Brexit. We were then standing there and saying like, "Okay, ooh, that happened, and now, should we think about that we maybe change something with the treaties? Do we focus on something else? Do we enlarge with other countries?" And, you know, coincidentally, if we would have the current 9 candidate countries joining, we would have the same population again, 511 million, because coincidentally, they almost to the person exactly have the same inhabitants as the United Kingdom. But we're not brave enough to talk about this. We're not brave enough to say, okay, let's use these opportunities that were there, use these challenges that were there and turn them into opportunities like Brexit. And let's talk about a treaty reform. Let's talk about how we can how we can make that happen. And if we historically look at what you also mentioned, if we historically look the way from the Treaty of Nice to the Treaty of Lisbon, with a negative referendum in France, a negative referendum in the Netherlands about the constitutional treaty, then a negative referendum in Ireland in 2008. With all these challenges that were there, the whole process took about 5 years. Now, we have recently at IDM analyzed how long negotiations for membership took, not granting candidate status and then signing the ratification, but simply the time, how long did they negotiate, start and end of negotiations. Longest country, Portugal, 77 months. Shortest country, UK, 12 months, all before the European Union existed. On average, though, 4.7 years, which means in 5 years, you can make a treaty reform with all these challenges. In 5 years, we have started and ended negotiations on average. And that is the term of a European Commission. So why is nobody brave enough going out there and saying, look, if you vote for your conservative party that is part of my political grouping in the European Parliament, we promise you this, this, and this. And for instance, one of the things could be treaty reform and enlargement, bring deepening and widening together, as we have successfully done in the past. And I don't know why we've stopped doing that and not implementing that in the future.
Well, you say people aren't brave enough. Which people? Are these the politicians? Is it the voters? Is it national institutions?
All of the above. Because, I mean, of course, it would take brave politicians first to say, look, this is what we want to do. But on the other hand, it would also take brave, in that sense, maybe even more informed people that demand that. Because, I mean, why can't they get away? Why can parties get away with not talking about European issues? Because people do not demand this enough. I've been doing these discussions after European elections since I deal with that for, I don't know, 20 years ago maybe. And it's always the same, and nothing changes in that regard. And this is not a one-way street. It's not only the politicians. We need to demand that.
Yeah, I would see two origins of the problem, or two obstacles to solving it. One is education, because I have three sons who were educated through the French system. My eldest son went to did his undergraduate degree in the UK in European studies. He was specialized, but because he had no exposure to that in our school systems. Now, I haven't examined the French school system recently, the educational programs, but I don't get the impression that anyone's making an effort to situate Europe as a theme that needs to be examined and reflected on in the schooling systems. I don't know, and I expect it's different in the 27 countries. So that's one thing. Has anyone tried to address the education question and to make it, it's not necessarily a question of imposing some kind of stricture on schools, but of encouraging the kind of effort that's needed to create a culture of interest in Europe in the schooling system, rather than balanced with the interest in national identity and all that. And the other issue for me is the media, because the media have no interest in promoting anything outside of the country, because it doesn't sell. The media are commercial entities. So are people in Europe aware of these questions, and is anyone thinking about how to address them?
Yes, as I said, these things. I mean, in your analysis, you're absolutely right, and this is something that is with us for decades. And yes, some politicians talk about this. Yes, some.
Is there a working group in Brussels?
There's no competences when it comes to this. This is one of the things. There's no competences in the field of education that would be supranational. There's no competences when it comes to media that is supranational. And you can debate that, and there might be good reasons for that. But your analysis is absolutely right. And there are examples that work on a very low scale. Arte would be an example. That's a German-French corporation, but it's a very niche TV outlet. There is, of course, cooperation on curricula in schools, especially also when it comes to European EU education, exchange programs. Erasmus contributes to that, definitely, but apparently not enough. And there would be, again, the need for a brave and bold step towards saying, let's do and try this. Yeah, why don't we pool the public broadcasting also on an EU level? Why is that not something that is done? Because in these times with fake news, that would actually be a very good solution to pool resources on an EU level and then make programs that don't necessarily have to be the same in all 27 countries, but to at least have a common idea on how to proceed here. And the same would go for, of course, school education.
Yes, I think most European decision makers, maybe the countries themselves, or people responsible in each of the countries, have some kind of idea at the back of their minds that we all know about European history, and ever since the Greeks, and Charlemagne and everything else that's happened in the Renaissance and all that. So it's all there. We don't need to make any effort, but it's not about remembering history. It's about creating history. That's what we're doing now, as we live as a political entity. And now it seems to me that there's a real good pretext for doing it. Everyone is aware, and I'm talking about how this could be initiated in Brussels, and maybe you could have some ideas about that. Everyone is aware of the fact that the world has changed. We're now living in a multipolar world. Nobody knows what that means. Nobody knows what the poles are yet. But we know that it's not the unipolar world that emerged in 1991. We can see in all the conflicts that are going on in Ukraine, in Gaza, and elsewhere, that that the world is structured differently today. It's changing its structure. So shouldn't it be obvious in Europe that we need to adjust our thinking and our communicating about how we see ourselves in this world? And I come back to the point I tried to make earlier, which I think is a real obstacle, and nobody wants to talk about it, and that is nobody other than Macron, on occasion, before he changes his position, who said that Europe must not be, or France in any case, and Europe must not be a vassal to the U.S. So there is in the back of people's minds, when you observe what's going on in the world, to the extent that people are aware of it, the idea that Europe doesn't have any power to define who it is in the world, because we're subservient to whatever happens in Washington. I don't know if that's getting into grounds that people don't want to talk about, but Alex, you're in New York, so I don't know how I don't know what contact you have with Americans about Europe, about how they feel about Europe.
Maybe that's a whole topic for the transatlantic relationships. Maybe we should put this into a separate talk, because we wouldn't have time to do justice now, but it's a very interesting one, and of course a very key question. But the average American is not very aware of what's going on.
Do Americans feel that they're in charge of Europe? Because obviously in the Beltway, that's the attitude. They are in charge of Europe.
Well, when my wife says she's from Switzerland, most people think it's Sweden. So that's how far the geographical knowledge goes. No, I mean, it's of course probably different if you look at the elites and the decision makers. So I'd say the average populace is not concerned with European issues or ideas. I mean, as most Europeans wouldn't know what the capital of Tennessee is either. It's just too far away, and
well, I think Europeans are more aware of the U.S. than the U.S.
a little bit, yeah, which is also
that's the soft power
if you come from a smaller entity, you are more outward looking by definition than if your entity is so big that you can go skiing on a glacier and go to the beach within the same country without ever needing a passport.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know what the capital of Tennessee is, but you can go skiing and to the beach in Slovenia.
There you go.
So I think we can, we've been going on for about an hour now. So Alex, I like your suggestion of organizing another session to look specifically at the transatlantic relationship question, which is evolving, radically, I think, every day. We're probably going to see a lot of interesting news coming out. But I just want to go back and conclude with the French situation. And I'll ask Sebastian, is anyone in Austria and maybe Germany or Eastern Europe, do they consider the French election to be something important which will have an impact on their future, or is it just entertainment? I say that because I'm totally enmeshed in it, of course.
I think what I said is very true also within Europe. That they are concerned primarily with themselves, and it's really, of course, in Austria, that who are the two candidates running for the U.S. presidential elections, because as it was rightly said, it's so important. Yeah. And of course, people know that there's something going on in France, and that Macron called for snap elections. But do they really care? Is there an emotional attachment to it? I would say very on the fringe.
Oh, but do they consider that it might have an impact on them, on their own future? And you've got the British elections as well. The 3 days separate the result.
But if you look at opinion polls for the parliamentary elections that are taking place on the 29th of September, I would say 30% of the Austrians don't even care what is happening in their own country, but still go to the elections because they are giving the vote to the far right party here.
But isn't the far right party in Austria? It's the Freedom Party, is that it? Wouldn't they be following keenly the French elections and publicizing it because they expect to win?
In a sense, maybe by sort of alignment in topics, definitely, and strategies, absolutely. And there is a very vivid exchange between the Freedom Party and the AfD in Germany on these type of tactics, but also what works and what doesn't. And they're very good in that, and they're very good in mobilizing, which is also the electoral success of the FPÖ in the because we don't really understand maybe the consequences yet, but it's for the first time that in a federal election the FPÖ is the strongest party. And this is very well something, because they have been in government, but they can still place themselves some sort of as the outside force. And this is the discussion that is going on, and that we'll see definitely. But the average Austrian doesn't care about the outcome of the French election. They are concerned with themselves, the challenges that they have. And the Freedom Party utilizes this as they tell them, we are going to solve all the problems.
So this is just one more manifestation of the lack of consciousness, of awareness of being European and having a common project to handle.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's hope. The one great thing about crises is that sometimes they provoke the kinds of actions that we don't see happening when there isn't a crisis. So maybe we're at an interesting moment of history for Europe. I certainly hope so.
Like the optimistic ending. Thank you very much. Let's hope so.
Okay, well, thank you both of you, Sebastian and Alex, for spending this time with us and exploring these things. And I'd like, if you're willing, I'd like to come back and follow this through, because as I said earlier, we're in the unknown, but we are observers of that unknown. And we can learn things every day and begin to understand things which don't seem clear at all today. So thank you very much, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer. and subscribe to our YouTube channel.